Hi, I'm Ellen, and in this video I'm going to show you how you can make your very own baseball cap. I did end up making a few mistakes along the way, so what I'll do is just show you the way that I found worked best, and then you can avoid making those same mistakes. Now, this isn't the easiest project in the world, but it's definitely doable and I think it's very fun. So get out the sewing machines and let's get started. To understand how a baseball cap is made, I got an old one from the second-hand store. It's stained and a kid used it to draw on, so I don't feel too bad about taking it apart. While I was at the second-hand store, I also got this men's shirt, which I will use as the fabric for my cap. It's pretty faded on the outside, but on the inside it still looks good. The first step is to take the old cap apart. You'll want to do this carefully since we'll be using the pieces to make a pattern. So get out that seam ripper and start taking it apart. Make sure you save the plastic insert in the brim because we'll be using that in our new cap. Now that we've got all the pieces, we can use them to make a pattern. To do that, I'm simply tracing the outline of the pieces onto some paper. While doing this, I make sure to fold the seam allowance out of the way. That way I can add a bigger seam allowance later, which will make sewing a lot easier. The cap has 3 different panels, a brim cover and a facing. After tracing each of these, I'm adding a 1.5 cm seam allowance around each of them. Then I cut them out and I have my finished pattern. The next step is to cut the pieces out of the fabric. Since my fabric is pretty thin and a bit stretchy, I'm also going to add interfacing to it. I start by taking my shirt apart so that I have flat pieces of fabric to work with. Next, I trace my pattern pieces onto my interfacing. For each of the 3 panels, I'll need a left and a right version, so the 2 pieces need to be mirrored versions of each other. To achieve this, I fold the interfacing over and cut through both layers at the same time. I then iron the interfacing onto the wrong side of the fabric, making sure to follow the stripes. The precise instructions are different for different brands of interfacing, so just follow the instructions that come with yours. Then I cut around the interfacing to get my final pieces. I repeated these steps for the facing, but only cutting 1, not 2. I cut 2 identical brim pieces without adding any interfacing. It's fine if the fabric remains a bit stretchy, since it will help to cover the brim nicely. I also left the fabric a bit big on the inside to give some room for error later. Finally, I decided to add a second layer of interfacing to the front panels. The front section is usually made a bit stiffer in baseball caps to help it keep its shape. You can just iron on the second layer directly on top of the first layer. Now on to the assembly. The easiest way is to make the 2 halves of the cap first and then stitch those together. I started by stitching the front and middle panel together for each of the halves. Place them right sides together, pin them in place along the seam and sew a straight stitch 1.5 cm from the side. But make sure that you don't sew all the way to the top. You'll want to stop about 1.5 cm from the end. This will make the next assembly steps much easier and neater. As you can see, I stopped my stitching about 1.5 cm from the top. And now for the secret trick. You'll want to press open each of the cap seams with an iron. It may seem like a lot of extra work or an unnecessary step, but you'll see that it's the key to making your cap look really clean and professional. I found the pressing around the curve works best on the tip of my ironing board, and you can see how it makes the outside look really smooth. Next, we're going to add 2 lines of top stitching, 1 on either side of the seam. Like the pressing, this helps to keep that seam really neat and gives your cap that professional look. It's best to do it with the right side of the fabric facing up, so you can make sure you keep the same distance from the seam. Just make sure you only stitch through a single layer of seam allowance underneath, but after the pressing that shouldn't be too hard. Now we're ready to add the back panels. Place them on top of the middle panel and pin it in place. Again, we'll sew 1.5 cm from the side and stop 1.5 cm from the top. Now you can really see the difference that the pressing and top stitching makes. Again, press open the seam allowances and top stitch on both sides of the seam. At this point you should see your 2 seams meet up at around 1.5 cm away from the top edge. To make sure the fabric doesn't ravel, you'll need to treat the edges. Since the interfacing will help against the raveling, it's enough to cut along the sides with pinking shears. If you don't use interfacing, you can stitch a zigzag stitch at the edge of all the seam allowances instead. The two halves are now finished and we can put them together. Place them right sides together and pin them in place, making sure that the centers line up. Sew along the top seam in one go, again 1.5 centimeters from the edge. Then press the seam open. Now is a good time to check the size of your cap. I actually didn't check until I did a few extra steps, as you can see here, and I had to undo those steps to make the cap fit me right. I pinched the fabric together so that it fit me properly, took it off and made marks to show how much I needed to take it in. I took out the back seam, drew a new stitching line and adapted my pattern for future use. I then stitched the new seam, pressed it open and added the top stitching. Then I cut off the excess fabric and the main part of the cap is done. Now I'm going to finish the back by adding bias tape around the raw edge. First, measure how long your bias tape needs to be. For me it's 20 centimeters. Then cut a piece of fabric on the bias of the fabric, which is at a 45-degree angle. Mine is 4 centimeters wide and 23 centimeters long. I made it a bit longer than needed, just to be safe. Because the fabric is cut on the bias, it's now a lot more stretchy than the original fabric, which is what you want. Fold over the edges to the middle and iron them down. Then fold the whole thing in half once more and iron it in place. I added 1.5 centimeters seam allowance to the back, which I don't need, so I'm marking it and cutting it off. Next I'm placing the bias tape around the raw edge and pinning it in place. Use lots of pins here since you're going around a curve. Use a straight stitch to sew it in place, close to the inner edge. To close the back I could use the snap from the original cap, but I decided to use elastic encased in fabric instead. First, measure how long the piece needs to be. For me it's 10 centimeters. I'm using elastic that's 2 centimeters wide, so I'm cutting a piece of fabric that's 4 centimeters wide and 10 centimeters long, plus seam allowances on all of the sides. I'm cutting a piece of elastic that is 6 centimeters and sewing it in place on either end of the fabric strip. This will make the fabric bunch around the elastic. I'm using a straight stitch to sew the elastic on one side of the center. Next I'm folding over the fabric and sewing right next to the elastic to make a tube. Stretch the elastic as you sew and make sure not to stitch through the elastic. Cut off any extra fabric next to the seam and then turn the tube inside out, so that the elastic ends up on the inside. I started by using a safety pin on a string to pull it inside out, but ended up using a chopstick to push it through. In the end you should have this nice stretchy piece to use on the back of your hat. Make a mark at 1.5 centimeters from the bottom of your cap and sew the elastic closure in place on both sides. We'll be folding over the extra fabric later to give the cap a nice edge. To make the cover for the brim, I'm tracing its shape onto the wrong side of the fabric. I'm then pinning the two layers together, but placing the top layer a bit inwards from the bottom layer. This way the bottom piece will be a bit smaller than the top piece, which will make the seam sit on the bottom side of the brim. This is another thing that will give your cap that professional look. I'm then sewing on top of the line that I drew earlier. If your fabric is not stretchy at all, you'll want to sew a bit on the outside of this line, otherwise your cover may end up being too small. I'm placing the brim insert inside to check the size, and I'm cutting some slits into the seam allowance to help it go around the curve of the brim, and then using the pinking shears around the edge to help against fraying. Turn the cover inside out and place the brim inside again. Push the seam allowance to the bottom side of the brim and pull the fabric nice and tight. You can see here how that seam ends up on the bottom side of the brim. Pin the fabric in place and use a zipper foot to sew as close to the edge of the insert as you can. Cut off the excess fabric to 1.5 centimeters of the seam and cut slits into it to help it around that curve. Place the brim right sides together on the front of the hat and pin it in place. Then sew it in place, again using a zipper foot and stitching as close to the edge of the insert as you can. This step is a bit tricky and it's very easy to sew through extra layers of fabric accidentally, so just take your time and possibly sew the seam in some sections. Finally, we're going to add the facing to the inside of the cap. First, cut little slits into the inside curve. Fold over this edge 1.5 centimeters, pin it in place and sew it down. Next, cut little slits in the outside curve and cut along the edges with pinking shears to prevent fraying. Place the facing right sides together along the bottom edge of the cap. Make sure to leave some extra room near the back and sew the facing in place at 1.5 centimeters from the edge. I found it worked best to sew the two sides in place first and then sew around the brim with a zipper foot. Fold the facing inside the hat and press it down with an iron. Finish the back edges by folding them inwards and stitching them in place. Finally, stitch along the whole edge of the cap around 3 mm from the bottom to keep the facing on the inside. Again, I stitch around the two sides first and then use the zipper foot to stitch along the brim. And our baseball cap is done! I'm really happy with how it turned out and I can't wait to wear it on a nice sunny day. And that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, then give it a thumbs up and I'll see you next time. Bye!